Most of us in the UK know someone who has COVID right now. Infection numbers are some of the highest of the pandemic, and that's causing disruption.
I think it would be very misleading if anyone were to get the impression that things are normal in schools. Everybody's trying their best to create normality, but the levels of COVID are still very high.
On the 17th of March, over 200,000 pupils were off school in England because of the virus. That's more than triple the figure of 2 weeks earlier. Hospital staff are also feeling the pressure, particularly in Scotland.
If I look at our NHS staff absences due to testing positive for COVID, they've increased by 100% over the last 4 weeks.
In England, NHS staff absences are higher than normal. Over 23,000 staff, that's 2% of the total workforce, were absent each day in the week to the 20th of March. And infection levels have been rising. In the week to the 19th of March, around 1 in every 16 people in the UK had COVID. And as all of this played out, England's Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty told us we should just roll with it rather than expect there is some end point. And no one disputes that we're going to be living with COVID for the foreseeable future. But that can mean quite different things. For the UK government, that means removing restrictions and this assessment.
Of course, we keep the data under review, but there's no particular cause for concern at this point.
And to assess the point we've reached with COVID, it's helpful to consider several factors. The first is why cases have gone up in March, and there are three primary reasons. One is that the subvariant of Omicron, called BA2, is highly transmissible. The second is waning immunity. BA2 has come when some elderly people may need a further booster jab. The third reason is this.
People are now mixing more than was the case even a few weeks ago, and that has added additional pressure on this increase.
Lifting restrictions has led to more mixing, but John Byrne-Murdoch of the FT argues this isn't the primary factor. He says data shows that restrictions pale into insignificance compared to the impact of new variants, whose emergence we have relatively little control over. Not everything can be blamed on a person or policy, he says. And if that's why cases are rising, next we should consider how that impacts on serious illness and why vaccines have been vital.
There is also a separation between that very high number and the numbers in hospital, the lengths of stay in hospital and the numbers of people needing ICU. Those are much lower.
Hospitalisations are rising, as you can see here, but they're nowhere near the peak of January last year. Also, half of the people in hospital at the moment with COVID were admitted with something else. And because the vaccine won't stop us catching COVID, this is how we could summarise the moment we've reached.
So it's a less serious in terms of hospitalisation and death, but there's a lot of it around in the community at the current time.
There is a lot of it around, and some argue that was predictable.
We knew that this was very likely to happen with a very, very highly transmissible variant of virus circulating already at high levels at a time when I think the public were getting the message that actually COVID was over.
The government would deny putting it in those terms. In February, this was Boris Johnson's message.
Let us learn to live with this virus and continue protecting ourselves and others without restricting our freedoms.
COVID wasn't over, but almost all restrictions in England were. The legal requirement to self-isolate when positive was gone. So was the legal requirement to wear masks in some situations. And from the 1st of April, lateral flow tests will no longer be free for most people. That's also the day when the advice changes on what to do if you test positive.
After that, we will encourage people with COVID and with COVID symptoms to exercise personal responsibility, just as we encourage people who may have flu to be considerate towards others.
That was the government's plan, and this was the opposition's response.
An approach which seems to think that living with COVID means simply ignoring it.
Mr Starmer also said this.
The Labour Party does not want to see restrictions in place for a moment longer than necessary.
As for public opinion on this, in early March, YouGov asked people if we should learn to live with COVID and get back to normal. 63% said yes, but much hinges here on what normal means. The academic, Professor Christina Pargle, wrote in February, many with mild illness will still need time off work or education. And as we've seen with Omicron, the aggregate effects can be hugely disruptive. In short, the world pre-2020 no longer exists, she argues. In the sense that COVID is here, that is true. But in terms of how we behave with the virus present, that is disputed. Professor Devi Sridhar noted recently that pandemics don't end with a parade or armistice. They end when the disease fades into the background and other pressing daily problems take priority. The war in Ukraine has certainly escalated that process. COVID is not the dominant issue it once was, but the virus remains, as do choices over how to respond to it. The government insists vaccines and natural immunity offer sufficient protection against severe COVID for restrictions to go. Others think that mask wearing and better ventilation could help contain the virus. And so, while the pandemic becomes, in the words of Chris Whitty, steadily less dominant over time, the disruption and the disagreements continue.